Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG Show for Thursday, June the 24th, 2021. Just a reminder that in approximately 90 minutes, I will be talking about a great film called Ugetso on Theater Thursday. But I'm going to begin today's show with the fight against Canada. Very conveniently, a week before Canada Day, formerly Dominion Day, we have this bombshell story from the CBC and many other outlets. Saskatchewan First Nation, or Indian Band, as they used to be called, announced its discovery of 751 unmarked graves near former residential school. The Cowessess First Nation announced a preliminary finding Thursday of 751 unmarked graves at a cemetery near the former Marival Indian residential school, which operated from 1899 to 1997 in the area where Cowessess is now located, about 140 kilometers east of Regina. Children First Nations in southeast Saskatchewan and southwestern Manitoba were sent to the school. The First Nation took over the school's cemetery from the Catholic Church in the 1970s. Earlier this month, Cowessess started using ground-penetrating radar to locate unmarked graves. It was not immediately clear if all the remains are connected to the residential school. Yes, indeed. Cowessess Chief Cadmus Delorme spoke at a virtual news conference Thursday morning. This is not a mass gravesite. These are unmarked graves, he said. He said there may have at one point been markers for the graves. He said the Roman Catholic Church, which oversaw the cemetery, may have removed markers at some point in the 1960s. He said it was not immediately clear if all the unmarked graves belonged to children, but that there were oral stories within Cowessess First Nation about both children and adults being there. He said some of the remains discovered may be people who attended the church or were from nearby towns. Delorme said that some 44,000 square meters of area were searched by technical teams from Saskatchewan Polytechnic, which the First Nation partnered with for the search. Thursday's announcement marked phase one of the First Nations search efforts. He said the community would continue search efforts in the area based on oral history. Last month, the Kamloops Indian Band in BC announced the discovery of a burial site adjacent to the former Kamloops Indian Residential School that preliminary findings indicate contains the remains of 215 children. Delorme said the community wants to put names to the people in the graves in the coming months. He said the community would be treating the site like a crime scene. He said we'd like to see a monument built at the site that includes the names of those identified. Okay, so what we're talking about is a graveyard that became unattended. There are many such graveyards in Canada and across the world where there were markers which have fallen to bits, or the stones have been taken away by people for one reason or another. But apparently this is a crime scene. It is a murder scene. Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations Chief Bobby Cameron said Thursday that what happened was a, quote, crime against humanity, and that the findings were just the start in terms of finding unmarked graves in Saskatchewan. The FSIN represents Saskatchewan's First Nations. There will be hundreds more unmarked graves and burial sites located across our First Nations land at the sites of former Indian residential schools. A crime against humanity. So were these people murdered? Is it commonplace for people who have been murdered to be marked, to be formally buried in this manner, in row upon row upon row? Not to my knowledge, actually. But the elite of my country has decided that Canada stinks and that it has always done so, and it does so today. What the end game here is rather difficult to see. The end game that I see is the dissolution of Canada itself. Canadian patriotism has been mocked essentially effaced since the 1960s. In 1965, our flag was taken away from us, and we were given a generic national flag. In the 1980s, our national holiday, Dominion Day, was taken away from us, and we were given a generic national holiday day called Canada Day, very imaginative, which is being canceled across Canada, including where I live in Victoria, because Canada, again, is so repugnant. Delorme called for a papal apology. The Pope needs to apologize, and apologize is one stage in the healing journey. The Pope needs to apologize because 100 years ago, people died and were buried in Saskatchewan. Really? The assumption is that if it weren't for the Catholic Church, which largely ran the residential schools, that these Indians would have lived forever. I'm going to talk about longevity in just a minute. But let's see. David Moscrop, who is author of Too Dumb for Democracy, a columnist at Post Opinions, that is the Washington Post, host of Open to Debate. What does he have to say? So the Catholic Church has committed yet another crime. And he says that it is time for a reckoning, individually and institutionally. I wonder what he has in mind. Perhaps the conversion of Catholic churches to temples of reason, the forced laicization of priests, gulags. He later said, Catholics, unless you're apologizing and or demanding your church be held to account, now is the time to be quiet. As I mentioned before, last year and this year have been heady times for atheists, and particularly for haters of the Catholic Church. COVID-19 is one reason. Why do these people insist on going out to churches when they should be at home, cowering in fear, and staring at a computer screen? There have been calls for the Catholic Church to be stripped of its tax-exempt status, which of course applies to all religious institutions in this country, including Satanists. But no. Jagmeet Singh is railing on about genocide. Of course, he ran in the last election, railing against racism, that Canada was a racist country. This man, whose people, Sikhs, came to Canada, in the 1970s, and Jagmeet decamped back to India, where he was raised, and then he went to Michigan, of all places, where he was schooled from grades 6 to 12. A man of the world, one might say. Jagmeet Singh, of course, has been campaigning against the government of India for decades, demanding that India be condemned for, guess what? Genocide against his people. Let's look at life expectancy from birth in Canada from 1800 to 2020. So why don't we start? Canada became a dominion, of course, in 1867. So why don't we start with 1870? The life expectancy from birth in Canada then was 42 years. It does not reach 50 until 1905. I suppose to people like Jagmeet Singh and this Moscrop fellow, Canadians would have lived to 80 back in the 19th and early 20th century if it weren't for the Catholic Church, murdering them. They really seem to be intent on memeing this into existence. Of course, the Reverend Michael Corrin, who was once a Catholic apologist, who decided, for reasons, I won't speculate, that he was going to leave the Catholic Church again after twice having made a substantial living from it at second hand, that he actually became an Anglican minister. And he is saying, oh, the Catholic Church must suffer for where this is. Let's see, in the same sermon where Father Owen Keenan spoke of the good done in residential schools, he also criticized Catholic schools for flying the pride flag, describing it as the standard of contemporary sexual license. Shameful, says Michael Koren. Michael Koren is a good Christian who believes in, gay sex and homosexual marriage and abortion and the sexual mutilation of children. And of course, if one does not hold all of these beliefs, one cannot have a journalistic career in my country. Michael Koren knows that. He knows it well. He knows it well. And he knows that one can do very well. One can do very well in Canada by pretending to be an outsider, by attacking the Catholic Church. Much of this hand-wringing over deaths associated with the residential school, or just Indian deaths in general, has to do, again, with the fact that the Catholic Church ran most of these residential schools. But the main part is that Canada's elite hates the Catholic Church because of its prohibition of homosexual acts, its opposition to homosexual marriage, its opposition to abortion, its opposition to the sexual mutilation of children. And if you go to, let's see, Catholic Church may have to ban themselves from communion. Ho, ho, ho. Yes. I speculated some years ago that it's only a matter of time until the Supreme Court of Canada rules that any religious entity that does have tax exemption must marry homosexuals. Maybe this will speed that up. And yes, heady days for Christophobes. Heady days for Christophobes in Canada. Let's see. FSIN Chief Bobby Cameron says that if the Pope doesn't give a formal apology for the Catholic Church's involvement in residential schools, he'll leave his Catholic faith. How hard is it for him to say, we are very sorry, we apologize, how can we help you heal? Well, Pope Benedict XVI apologized some years ago, but not for the residential schools themselves, but that is not enough. Why should the Catholic Church apologize for the residential schools? The Indians were going to be left on the reserves, not knowing how to read or write or count, with no skills. Good men and women came to Canada from all over the world and lived in often dreadful conditions in order to bring the faith and to bring education to Canada's native people. But as they say, no good deed goes unpunished. Let's have a look at the chat. Hello to Buddy. Let's say good evening from rainy Midwest USA. Baseball canceled tonight. Well, we're expecting record temperatures here in what the Americans call the Pacific Northwest. It is going to reach close to 90 degrees here in Victoria over the weekend, which is pretty shocking weather, I must say. Hello to Anrun, random number generator, to our valiant moderator, Chad Chadson. Thank you for your service. To William Hicks, Kontiki Roulette, a star rover who points out every cemetery has many unmarked graves. I volunteer to keep the records for a cemetery, and there are probably over 1,000 unmarked graves. Well, there is a well-known cemetery in Victoria, I suppose the oldest one in this region, and I have visited it. It's a popular destination for tourists, and there are many unmarked graves. And as I said earlier, one of the reasons being is that the markers have fallen to bits, or they've been kicked away, or they have been stolen by people for one reason or another. Again, our media is pretending that they don't know how graveyards work. Perhaps they don't. They certainly don't know, or don't pretend to know, what longevity was in this country 100 years ago, or even in the decades after that. Before the invention of antibiotics, people would get sick. They'd have some sort of infection and they would die, typically horribly, a few days later. But they've forgotten that. Okay, hello to Palcasso 88. Chogakin 666. Dan Allison says, people love this stuff. The facts don't matter. Repenting for other people's sins is the cheapest grace on the market. Rollo Klevich says, it looks like they died about the time of 1918 flu epidemic that killed millions. Yes, many, it would seem, died because of the Spanish flu and previous flu epidemics, but there is also tuberculosis, which killed a great many. Tuberculosis has pretty much been eradicated in the West, but of course that was not the case 100 years ago. And hello to a Tricky Who and to Polygon's visionary companion. Greetings from the U District, he says. A Muslim born in Kenya will become Canada's first non-white Supreme Court justice on July the 1st. He came to Canada when he was 14 years old. I was raised memorizing Arabic prayers from the Quran. Jagmeet Singh is an example of a severe difficulty with immigration, which is to say, they speak of, the Ellis Island problem in the United States. That the United States didn't exist until my clan arrived. Well, it's a little different in Canada because there were very few people who were not of Anglo and Irish stock in Canada until the 1970s. And so these people began arriving in the 1970s and 1980s, and they have no interest in Canada's history, none whatsoever. They have no interest in or reverence for Canada's traditions either. Effectively, the country did not begin until their people showed up. And since Canada has been officially multicultural since 1971, what that means is there has been no effort to assimilate immigrants in my country. And they come here, they get affirmative action, and then they tell us how horrible we are. Here's a story I referred to earlier by Samantha Beattie from CBC. A Mississauga, Ontario priest is under fire after sermon referencing the good done by the Roman Catholic Church in residential schools, saying some might go so far as to even thank it. During his sermon at the Merciful Redeemer Parish last Sunday, Monsignor Owen Kean referenced the Kamloops, BC residential school, where the local Indian band reported it had discovered the preliminary remains of more than 200 children in unmarked graves in May. That is not, okay, all right. 2/3 of the country is blaming the church, he said, which we love, for the tragedies that occurred there. He said in a video originally posted to the church's YouTube page, but since deleted, clips of his sermon continue to circulate on social media. I presume the same number would thank the church for the good done in those schools, but of course that question was never asked, and we are not allowed to even say that good was done there. I await to see what comes to my inbox. A clip of Keenan's comments sparked outrage on social media, with one person tweeting that the priest's comments were really disgusting and that the church is not the victim. Oh, yes, this comes from AJ Marchese, co-host of 7 Rounds in Heaven, an NFL draft podcast. Well, thank you for your input. Mississauga Mayor Bonnie Crombie, a practicing Catholic, said that she was, quote, extremely disappointed by her pastor's comments about residential schools. Reading from a prepared statement at a news conference Thursday, the mayor called Keenan's homily deeply insensitive to Indigenous Canadians, particularly at a time when Indigenous communities are in pain as they unearth more mass graves at the sites of former residential schools. Well, once again, there are graves, unmarked graves, mass graves, Indian graves called middens all over Canada. His comments show a fundamental misunderstanding of one of the core tragedies of the residential school system in Canada. The children were forcibly separated from their parents. Yes, they were forcibly separated from their parents. The planted axiom here is if they hadn't been separated from their parents, they would have lived to be 100. Dr. Suzanne Schusch, who is Indigenous, works for the Catholic-run health network, Unity Health Toronto. She is demanding the Pope apologize. She said comments like those made by Keenan are damaging to reconciliation and exemplify why Catholic leaders need to intervene. Yes, reconciliation. Once again, you give us more money for them programs and lecture us on how wicked we are. That's what reconciliation means in my country. And of course, the Archdiocese of Toronto said in a statement that it's been in contact with Keenan to convey the deep pain and anger some felt. He has pledged to fully educate himself about the history of residential schools. We apologize to anyone offended by his remarks, the Archdiocese said. So the Archdiocese, of course, is now defaming the memory of those brave men and women religious who, again, brought the gospel to the heathen and taught them to read and write and count, that these people are ashamed of their own religion. And, well, what this tells me is that the persecution comes to the Catholic Church in Canada, which it may well do. We're not going to see very much resistance from Canada's religious leaders, especially from its prelates. We saw during COVID-19, oh, please, let's close down the churches and let's keep them closed down. You don't need to go to Mass anymore. You don't need the sacraments anymore. We want to be good little Canadians. And if that means effectively shutting down the Catholic Church, well, that's a small price to pay. So let's see here. Oh, let's talk about Mark Milley. This is from Newsweek. General Mark Milley's passionate defense of critical race theory viewed over 6 million times. Yes, I was constantly being admonished on Twitter yesterday, well, and today, that I must listen to General Mark Milley as if he was some sort of modern Demosthenes. And you can watch the clip. You can hear him bumbling through this response. And then finally he gets all puffed up and he's outraged. Oh, before I move into that, I should have mentioned this before. It's a press release from the city of Victoria, or the People's Republic of Victoria, which has 9 councillors, 3 of whom are lesbian. The Canadian flag will fly at half-mast at Victoria City Hall on Wednesday, June the 23rd, to mark the National Day of Remembrance for Victims of Terrorism. Okay. I've noticed that the Canadian flag has been flying not only at City Hall, which is like 2 or 3 blocks from where I am now, but at the Military Armory, which is about a mile from where I am now. It seems to be for weeks that it's been flying at half-mast. The Canadian flag will continue to fly at half-mast until further notice to honor those who suffered trauma and harm at the former residential school in Kamloops, and for their families and communities who are mourning. We don't know we don't know, actually, what's in what was found at Kamloops. There has been no evidence presented, merely a claim. How long ago did these people die? Well, if they died 100 years ago, say, obviously there are no living relatives. But Mark Milley wants to teach us all about white rage. because apparently that is the biggest problem that the United States is suffering from now. And it is the greatest threat, terrorist threat. White people are the greatest terrorist threat. And how do you know that they're terrorists? Because they are Trump supporters. Mark Milley, if I'm not mistaken, has been intervening in politics for quite some time. Yes, Mark Milley was one of the generals letting Trump know that he better not step out of line, or the military might have to intervene. The clip of almost 2 minutes shows the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, defending studying critical race theory in order to understand race relations in the United States. He said, first of all, on the issue of critical race theory, etc., I'll obviously have to get much smarter on whatever the theory is, but I do think it's important, actually, for those of us in uniform to be open-minded and be widely read. And the United States Military Academy is a university, and it is important that we train and we understand. Milley added, and I want to understand white rage, and I'm white, and I want to understand it. So what is it that caused thousands of people to assault this building and try to overturn the Constitution of the United States of America? What caused that? I want to find that out. I want to maintain an open mind here, and I do want to analyze it. It's important that we understand that because our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Guardians, they come from the American people. So it is important that the leaders now and in the future do understand it. He said that he found it offensive that officers in the military were being called woke for studying theories that are out there. He said that he had read Marx and Lenin, but that didn't make him a communist. Oh, well, soldiers at the West Point would read Marx and Lenin because they wanted to understand their enemy. Okay. So is what he's saying that in studying critical race theory, that the cadets at West Point, they're learning to understand the enemy, which is white people? That's the clear implication of what he had to say. But of course now, everyone loves the military now. Well, everyone loves the generals. The progressives love the generals because the generals are progressive, very progressive indeed. And when there was talk of a military coup against Trump, as I've mentioned before, as I've joked before, it was like that Frankenheimer film based on the bestseller 7 Days in May, only this time the traitors are the good guys. And more on this from the Washington Examiner. Republicans who have been challenging the spread of woke ideology in the military and elsewhere are not pleased with how Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman General Mark Milley hit back on their concerns about critical race theory. And Milley's impassioned response did not sit well with Republicans who are focused on combating critical race theory both culturally and legislatively. I've heard directly from numerous concerned parents, cadets, soldiers, and veterans about West Point hosting Dr. Carol Anderson, who has called the Republican Party's platform white nationalism, to lecture about whiteness and white rage and teaching critical race theory. As a combat vet, I can tell you this is divisive to unit conviction, said a Representative Michael Waltz. Yes, I guess teaching the military elite of the United States that white people are the enemy. I just wonder, General Milley thinks that very many white people are going to want to join the military and potentially risk their lives for an organization that hates them and considers them to be the enemy. On Fox News on Wednesday night, Waltz said that he thinks Milley is confusing critical race theory for some sort of diversity training or history class on fascism and communism. Indiana Representative Jim Banks, who last week confronted Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Michael Gilday for including Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist on a professional reading program reading list, was also frustrated with Milley's rant. I served in the Navy with sailors from all backgrounds, and we shared a belief in the goodness of America and our Constitution. In other words, service members were very diverse and very anti-woke, Banks said. The most ridiculous assertion Milley made was that Republicans are attacking rank-and-file service members for being woke. The opposite is true. We're defending service members from indoctrination by woke political leaders. Of course, there's also the tremendous implication that Milley thinks that what happened in the Capitol on January the 1st was not at best a riot, but was an insurrection and an attempt to overturn the Constitution of the United States, rather histrionic at best and quite sinister at worst. I was lucky I came across this shortly before I put together my list of things to talk about. And just to give you an idea of who was on the other side of this issue, there's a site called Defense One, and the executive editor is a fellow called Kevin Barron. And he has a piece at defenseone.com, which is called Mark Milley Anti-Racist. The Joint Chiefs Chairman's defense of anti-racism education continues his support for American values he says are at the heart of the U.S. military. Here's how he begins. I don't know if Representative Matt Gaetz, Republican of Florida, hates me because I'm Jewish. I don't know if he thinks I'm less of an American because I'm not a white Christian. But I'm positive that General Mark Milley doesn't think that way. I responded to Kevin Barron on Twitter saying, and quoting him, the first two sentences, hating me because I'm Jewish, think I'm less of an American because I'm not a white Christian. No, people can't stand you because you poison the well. You see, this is a form of fallacious argument in which, oh, someone who disagrees with me must be an anti-Semite, must hate Jews. Well, Kevin Barron wasn't part of this conversation until he dragged himself into it, waving a little flag as if to say, hey, over here, I'm Kevin Barron and I'm Jewish, and this is my opinion, and if you disagree, you must hate Jews. This is contemptible, and it is dangerous. It's dangerous kind of speech. Because it invokes the kinds of feelings that Kevin Barron claims to be against. He continues, there's a battle for America going on right now. Milley stood on a wall, as most military men and women do, and defended it. Wait a minute, aren't walls evil things? It's a wall between freedom and fascism, good and evil. It's a wall holding back something sinister that we've seen in human history before, here and elsewhere. Here, I presume he's talking about Hitler. Was there an American Hitler? I seem to have missed that. Perhaps there was. Huey Long, was he America's Hitler? I don't know. Richard Nixon? Donald Trump? He didn't build the wall. It's always existed. This extended wall metaphor. Again, we were taught for 4 years by people like Kevin Barron that walls are bad things, that we don't want walls. We want bridges. He didn't build the wall. It's always existed, but it's a wall that partisan factioned opportunists like Gaetz and other firebrand extremists depend upon. That's mighty impressive professional writing there. Partisan factioned opportunists. Firebrand extremists. Yeah, Matt Gaetz, some firebrand. They use it hoping to separate themselves and a narrowly defined and experienced America from what exists before their very eyes. Now, wait a minute. He was arguing that walls are a good thing. Then he turns on a dime. He says they use it hoping to separate themselves, so walls are a bad thing again. Led most recently by ex-President Donald Trump, they brand nearly every segment of American society that doesn't look, sound, talk, think, vote, or pray like them as enemies of the state, including now the U.S. military. This is what they call projection. It's like that poem, First They Came for the You-Know-the-One. In the past 4 years, with the rise of the Trump era's brand of white supremacy and nativism, yes, the President Donald Trump who invited Kanye West to the White House, who moved to reduce black sentencing, who went out of his way to demonstrate how much he likes black people and wants to help them. The funny kind of white supremacy there. The far right has been embraced by the center right, and they've targeted a similar list of enemies: journalists, Muslims, black protesters, imaginary caravans of culture-changing Latino immigrants. Oh, wait a minute. These were imaginary caravans? Oh, of culture-changing Latino immigrants, which is a good thing because, everyone wants a bunch of foreigners just to cross over the border illegally and change everything. I mean, you'd have to be a fascist to be against that. The conspiracy of globalist Jews, moderate conservatives, and women. But wait a minute, he just said that the far right has been embraced by the center right, and then he talks about moderate conservatives as if, okay, and women, gays, and transgender Americans who serve their country in uniform. Well, now they're coming from the generals. This is pretty much illiterate spleen. But again, the message that we're getting from the Biden administration and from their supporters in the media, in the elite, is there's a new America now, and you better get down with the program, because if you don't, you are a fascist, and you will have to be dealt with. Let's talk a little bit about the new America. Let's talk about its taxonomy. Here's a site called racialequitytools.org, which is sort of a one-stop shop for everything you need to know about the new America. It begins, words and their multiple uses reflect the tremendous diversity that characterizes our society. Indeed, universally agreed upon language on issues relating to racism is non-existent. We discover that even the most frequently words in any discussion on race can easily cause confusion, which leads to controversy and hostility. It is essential to achieve some degree of shared understanding, particularly when using the most common terms. In this way, the quality of dialogue and discourse on race can be enhanced. Oh, but race is a social construct. It doesn't exist. How can we have a discourse on race when race is a chimera? Okay. Let's see. Let's look at some of these things. Let's look at bigotry. Intolerant prejudice that glorifies one's own group and denigrates members of other groups. Critical race theory. The critical race theory movement considers many of the same issues that conventional civil rights and ethnic studies take up, but places them in a broader perspective that includes economics, history, and even feelings, and the unconscious. Unlike traditional civil rights, which embraces incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and principles of constitutional law. Yeah, who wants to overturn the Constitution now? Eh? Cultural misappropriation distinguishes itself from the neutrality of cultural exchange, appreciation, and appropriation because of the insistence of colonialism and capitalism. Cultural misappropriation occurs when a cultural fixture of a marginalized culture community is copied, mimicked, or recreated by the dominant culture against the will of the original community, and above all, commodified. Yeah, okay. I'll take cultural misappropriation seriously. When various inventions, I don't know, like electricity, say, or the microphone, or magnetic tape, or computers, hey, you didn't invent them, so hands off. When we start hearing that talk, once again, I will take cultural misappropriation seriously. Inventions are for everyone to enjoy. It's that simple. And the trade has been going in this direction, not in the other direction. Implicit bias, also known as unconscious or hidden bias. Implicit biases are negative associations that people unknowingly hold. They're expressed automatically without conscious awareness. Many studies have indicated that implicit biases affect individuals' attitudes and actions, thus creating real-world implications, even though individuals may not even be aware that those biases exist within themselves. Notably, implicit biases have been shown to trump individuals' stated commitments to equality and fairness. Don't you mean equity? Because we just heard about critical race theory that we've moved on from equality. Equality is racist, thereby producing behavior that diverges from the explicit attitudes that many people profess. The implicit association test is often used to measure implicit biases with regard to race, gender, sexual orientation, age, religion, and other topics. And yes, und so weiter. As I say, you can find this very useful taxonomy at racialequitytools.org. Oh, I can't resist this one. White fragility, a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable for white people, triggering a range of defensive moves. These moves include the outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation. These behaviors, in turn, function to reinstate white racial equilibrium. Oh, okay, so let's see, argumentation and science. So if you argue with someone's assumptions, then you're guilty of white fragility. If you just keep silent, then you are guilty of white fragility. I suppose the only acceptable answer is, I'm white, I'm evil. How must I be punished? I'm very grateful for however you shall chastise me. And please, sir, can I have some more? I suppose that is the only reasonable, equitable response. And speaking on the war on all political opponents, this is from Joel Pollack at Breitbart. The state of New York has suspended Rudy Giuliani's law license over his claims of fraud in the 2020 election, according to a court decision released Thursday. For the reasons that follow, we conclude that there is uncontroverted evidence that respondent communicated demonstrably false and misleading statements to courts, lawmakers, and the public at large in his capacity as lawyer for former President Donald J. Trump and the Trump campaign. So what? So what? Many lawyers in the state of New York, particularly those, I don't know, perhaps those who claimed that the 2016 election was stolen, or that the 2004 election was stolen, or that the 2000 election was stolen, or that Stacey Abrams is actually the legitimate governor of Georgia. How exactly does Giuliani, disagreeing with the narrative on what happened last November, how does this disqualify him as a legal professional? Are they going to start quizzing lawyers now on their views on, I don't know, heliocentrism, or Darwinian evolution, or COVID-19? Perhaps. We've already had doctors in Ontario and elsewhere threatened with being struck off the register if they make statements contrary to the COVID-19 narrative. Make no mistake, people, this is a war that we are talking about. Back to the chat here. Yo Mama says, what do you know? I was just reading about the League of the Militant Godless. Is that godless or goddess? I sometimes I get confused looking at what's on the chat here, because it's in the font is very small. It's like a 6-point font. Okay. Isn't Canada's highest immigration official an illegal immigrant? Polygons. No, that was not our current immigration minister, the one before. He gleefully admitted to the New York Times, no less, and you can find this online, that he was an illegal immigrant from Somalia. SR says, I just can't get over the idea that people immigrate to a country, then insult and berate the very people that welcomed them in and provided them with a better life. None of these people feel anger. They smell green, says Kontiki Roulette. I would say 6 of one, half a dozen, or another. But he says, my son is in a miserable slump. Started season hitting leadoff and leading the team in average and on base percentage, now batting ninth. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. Texas Feral Hog says, can we arrest Biden for violation of posse comitatus? Polygon says, Republicans and conservatives don't have the language or understanding to combat CRT. Well, the woman with that strange name, something Borisenko, that I was talking about yesterday, that, oh, yes. You see, the people who are attacking CRT are actually white supremacists. And then it hit me. This is Bolshevik speak. It's pure Bolshevik speak. You see, taking the reasonable position, like Stalin, in the middle, fighting against both the left deviationists and the right deviationists. With regard to CRT, Conservatism Inc. has decided that it's going to continue to try to sell us the rope with which we will be hanged. Steve says, military officers are part of the managerial class and absorb all the same values as their peers. Indeed. Unofficial KMG fan club says they installed these maudlin dorks to prevent Spain in 1936. Yeah, well, I don't know whether General Milley knows about what happened in Spain in 1936. Perhaps he might want to read up about that. Had never heard anyone pronounce antebellum before. Military not sending their best. Again from Steve, let's send a force of trans lesbians who were raised to hate America to fight their wars. SR says, so long as racism remains the highest sin among the right, it will continue to be an effective tool for the left. The right seems to buy into all of the suppositions of the left. Well, conservatives do. People on the right don't. In fact, that's how you can tell who's on the right, because they're not conservatives and they're not weeping tears about racism, whatever that word means. As the great Peter Simple said, it is a word that must always be put within inverted commas. Chogokin666 says, these brass are digging their own graves. All their technology will not win a ground war, and it hasn't won a war since World War II. If things go hot, U.S. forces are toast. Well, yes, I've seen pictures of graduates from West Point. They do not inspire confidence in any way. And of course, then you learn that West Point now considers itself to be a football team more than anything else. And yes, let's let in a bunch of people with 80 and 90 IQs because we need to win football games. Unofficial KMG fan club. As a vet, I fully support the wokening of the military. They'll be even more incompetent and useless than they already are. Nothing will ever come between my love beans on toast. Okay. Kontiki Roulette likes beans on toast. Polygon says walls are bad, except when they protect the oligarchs and corporate elite from the proles. Yes, exactly. Gated neighborhoods, as Birkin Sultanov points out. Mark Raymond says, I lost a friend this week who has suddenly developed psychotic outrage about the Catholic Church vis-a-vis residential schools. I tried to debate him, but he only offered emotional slogans and CBC factoids. And from Polygons says, what is this? SJW simply can't help themselves. It's what Hegel called the Liste, what's this? Vernunft, the cunning of reason. The wicked always shoot themselves in the foot and bring about the opposite of what they intend. And let's see. Is public transportation in Victoria any good? It says Paul Casso 88. It depends if you stick to the main roads. There's a big problem with Victoria. Well, for me anyway. I grew up in Vancouver, which has a very strict grid. Like this, right? It's all right angles. Victoria is the oldest settlement in British Columbia, and there are all these winding roads. And it is difficult to know which direction you're going in Victoria. In Vancouver, well, the mountains are north. The oceans are west. The Fraser River is south. And then there's one artificial boundary only with Burnaby, which is to the east. I've had the situation in Victoria where a former boss of mine, when we were leaving his house where one of his office was and driving down this road to get on the main road, I said, "What are those mountains?" And he gave me a look as if I were an idiot. And he said, "The Olympic Mountains." And I thought, they're not supposed to be here. They're supposed to be over there. But of course, when you're driving on roads which are going like this and this and this, well, I suppose the mountains could be anywhere. Facile Goose says, Millie shares the goblin toad phenotype with Brennan. Not quite as extreme as Brennan. Okay. Moving on from Rudy Giuliani. Apparently judges are reprogramming people who've been found guilty of trespassing. U.S. District Judge Royce Lamberth castigated Republican lawmakers Wednesday for downplaying the violence of the mob that stormed the Capitol January 6th, saying and handing down the first sentence to a charged defendant that those who break the law must pay a penalty. Except if you riot in Washington and destroy things directly after what Trump was inaugurated, unless you riot in Minneapolis and Kenosha and all these cities across the United States, causing billions of dollars in damage, rioting and looting. Hardly any of those people paid any price at all. Yes, and we find out that this woman who was convicted, she's been given a reading list where, she now knows that she was wrong about everything. This woman called Morgan Lloyd said in court papers that she graduated from community college, worked for a medical device maker, is a mother to 2 stepdaughters, and helps care for 5 grandchildren. Raised a Democrat, she supported Trump for president beginning in 2016. She said that she and her friends came to Washington to show that a lot of the American people support Trump and that she did not intend to do more than walk to the Capitol. The government sentencing recommendation of 36 months of probation is greater than a 12-month term of supervision that would follow a maximum 6-month prison term for someone convicted of parading, picketing, or demonstrating in the Capitol. Most first-time misdemeanor offenders do not deserve prison time. Do you remember when anti-Trump protesters attempted to storm the White House last year? That has been completely memory hold. It's just vanished. Never happened. Make-A-Wish Foundation. We all know what the Make-A-Wish Foundation is, right? Now we find out that it is the foundation is requiring Wish kids, their siblings, and other family members, and any minors participating in the Wish to be fully vaccinated before having their wishes granted. These are terminally ill children, but they gotta get the jab. This is just a religious ceremony now. Just a religious ceremony. Mark Raymond says Victoria is easy to orient oneself around. The roads follow a grid, except for Kingsway, which cuts a long diagonal path through the city and right through my neighborhood. Yeah, it's true. It is almost impossible to get lost in Vancouver. The streets that run from east to west are numbered. They're numbered. And the other streets are given names named after varieties of trees or provinces or whatever like that. So, yes, when I was living in Saanich, which is a few miles from here, I like to walk. And, after it stopped raining, I thought, I could walk all the way downtown, get something to eat, something to drink. And I found out that I would have to go down Quadra Street, which is one of the main arteries in Victoria and Saanich. There was literally no other way to get downtown. No other way. And Quadra Street is clogged with cars emitting pollution and noise pretty much at all times. And it wasn't a very pleasant walk. If you live in Vancouver and you want to move in a certain direction, and say you don't want to walk along Oak Street or Granville Street or Mackenzie or any street which is very thickly populated with cars, you can simply move 1 or 2 blocks away and then follow in the same direction. But you cannot do that here. DC mayor is denying that there were several days of rioting last summer, says Birkin Sultanov. Well, I'm not surprised, because these people make their own reality. This is from Paul Joseph Watson at Summit News. MP, a Conservative MP, John Whittingdale, says that important people shouldn't need to quarantine under COVID rules. Well, that really gets to the heart of it, doesn't it? I mean, we can't have certain people inconvenienced. I mean, he's obviously an essential person. Sydney, that would be Sydney, Australia, not Sydney, Vancouver Island, enters scariest phase of pandemic as Delta variant spreads, leader says. This is a story from Rachel Pannett at the Washington Post. Australia is regularly hailed as one of the best places to be during the coronavirus pandemic, with low case numbers, comparatively few deaths, and a strict quarantine system for returning residents and citizens. That might have something to do that Australia is an island, which is at the bottom of the South Pacific, which is pretty much a long way for almost every other place on Earth, but that never gets brought up in these stories. But authorities say parts of the country are entering the most worrisome phase of the virus fight, just as vaccinated Americans are ditching masks and Europe is lifting bans on travelers. Gladys Berejiklian, the Premier of New South Wales, home to Sydney, said Thursday that an outbreak of the highly infectious Delta or Indian variant in the city meant that it was facing perhaps the scariest period of the entire pandemic. The cluster began last week with an airport limousine driver and has grown to 36 cases, including 11 announced Thursday. 36 cases. So let's just check the math here, okay? And 36 cases. So what is Australia? A village of 100 souls, something like that? Because in that case, 36 cases would be significant. But no, we find out that the population of Australia is around 24 million people. How about Sydney? Again, is this just a village? No. Actually, it's rather larger than that. It is a city of 5.4 million people. And let's look at the overall numbers in Australia. Let's particularly look at the number of deaths. There have been 910 deaths in Australia attributed to COVID-19 from February of last year. And they are in a panic. 54 in New South Wales. 54. One can see why they're so vigilant. So Australians seem to be rivaling Canadians for the most effeminate, hysterical people on Earth. You gotta keep the panic going. Got to keep the panic going. Got to recharge the panic. An interesting column from Carl Denninger at marketticker.org, and he is not pleased with the vaccine news, particularly its use in those under 18 and in healthy adults under 50. The CDC documents about 35 total COVID-related deaths in people under the age of 18 years all the way back to March of 2020. And then he provides a table, which he says is utterly gobsmacking damnable, and this is what we get for warp speed. A litany of serious harms, many of which will wind up as deaths. More deaths in those under 18 than COVID caused. And this is a report of myocarditis and pericarditis. These are reports to VAERS following dose 2. The experience versus expected rate is anywhere from 10 to 100 times higher than random chance in those under 24 years old, and from 3 to 30 times higher in those under 30. If we presume that 1 in 10 of these cases will eventually kill the person involved, which is likely conservative, the usual expectation is that half of these cases in the population generally that result in hospitalization eventually progress to heart failure and either a transplant or death within 5 years. These side effects will kill more people in the under 25 group than COVID has all the way back to the start of the pandemic. The others who are not killed will end up with monstrous medical bills they will have to pay and some amount of permanent damage to their cardiac health. This is from one side effect alone. Only those over 50 have an incidence of this result that is in line with expectations. Everyone younger is either at or beyond the upper boundary. In addition, this data is almost certainly incomplete as VAERS is a non-mandatory system and thus does not capture all events. The degree of underreporting is not able to be accurately bracketed, but that it occurs is an absolute fact. Therefore, these reports are floors, not ceilings, and as such must be taken as a lower boundary only. Yet even in that context, they demonstrate utterly unacceptable risk that in any ordinary civil proceeding would lead to strict liability. Let's look at Atlantic Canada. Elizabeth Smith McCrossan, the member of the legislature at the center of the New Brunswick-Nova Scotia border blockade, has been kicked out of the Nova Scotia Progressive Conservative Caucus. Tory leader Tim Houston made the announcement Thursday, less than 24 hours after offering lukewarm support for his caucus colleague. The decision follows a caucus meeting where Smith McCrossan was asked to explain her involvement in the blockade. Okay, so the province of Nova Scotia decided to isolate itself completely from the world. Yes. And how many, they're stacking up the dead bodies like cordwood in Nova Scotia, right? Which has somewhat over 900,000 people. Last time I checked, fewer than 90 deaths. Just absolute hysteria. Absolute hysteria. And yes, cutting oneself off the world. But, you know, in the race between Canada and Australia to see which country in the Anglosphere is most effeminate in hysteria, I mean, the lead seesaws back and forth. Here is an actual official tweet from the Government of Canada, specifically Public Safety Canada. Summer 2K21 is here. When hitting summer 2K21, why not just summer 2021? When hitting the beach or going outside, remember to practice physical distancing, wear masks, apply sunscreen. And there's a picture of two pineapples with sunglasses wearing masks, which are physically distant. As Citizen Free Press comments, Public Safety Canada tells citizens to wear masks to the beach this summer. Say a prayer for our brothers and sisters to the north. And here's a bunch of pictures of people at the beach wearing masks. And let's have a look at lockdown skeptics. Lockdowns did not lead to reductions in excess deaths. This is a study from the U.S. think tank, the National Bureau of Economic Research, which shown once again that lockdown policies produced no discernible reduction of the pandemic death toll. If anything, they increased it. A peer-reviewed vaccine study says that the vaccines kill one person for every 3 lives they save. A handful of countries added to the British government's travel green list. A defense of Boris Johnson. Number of children taking antidepressants reaches record high during lockdown. Earlier this week, it was reported that children as young as 5 are having panic attacks over meeting their friends following almost 15 months of heavy government restrictions on socializing. Now data has shown that the use of antidepressants among British children has reached an all-time high over the past year of repeated lockdowns, with many children having been prescribed drugs because waiting times to see health professionals were too long. According to The Telegraph, more than 27,000 children were prescribed antidepressants last year, the figures show. The idea that any child would be prescribed antidepressants for any reasons is disgusting. And the medical profession is, well, we hear a lot about this word reckoning. Yes, I think the medical profession is heading for a reckoning. They are determined to poison our children in every possible manner through drugs and or surgery. U.S. medicines regulator to add warning to Pfizer and Moderna vaccines over link to heart inflammation. The FDA is set to add a warning to the COVID vaccines after the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said there is a likely link between them and cases of heart inflammation, particularly in children and young adults. Do you remember when people were being banned from social media for suggesting that this might be the case? Well, now the FDA and the CDC are saying, yeah, it is the case. Oh, are we getting any apologies from these people? Or are they just going to pretend that people who suggested any kind of a link were demonized as conspiracy theorists, or even in many cases as white supremacists? No legal compulsion to wear face masks after July the 19th, says a government minister. And why hasn't the government published a cost-benefit analysis of lockdown? To ask the question is to answer it, as they say. And let's go to Alex Berenson's Twitter feed. Okay. Let's see. Something I can use here. Quick update. As people have pointed out, the vaccine takes 2 doses, so we should compare combined hospitalization after both to COVID hospitalizations. That gets us to 300 hospitalizations over 100,000 adolescent vaccinations versus 150 over 100,000 COVID cases, 2-to-1. Yay, vaccines. People keep asking me why they're lying in ways so easy to catch. The truth is, I don't know, and I have to focus on the data on catching the lies. And people usually lie incrementally rather than in some grand plan. But yes, sooner or later, the question needs an answer. Rochelle Walensky, MD, MPH, of course, is the head of the CDC, who famously almost burst into tears in her first press conference, moaning about how scared she was. She tweeted, to put this into perspective, if we vaccinate 1 million 12 to 17-year-olds, we could see 30 to 40 mild cases of myocarditis. In the same 1 million, through vaccination, we avoid 8,000 cases of COVID-19, 200 hospitalizations, 50 ICU stays, and 1 death. The benefits far outweigh the risks. Berenson comments, none of what she says is true. Again, the director of the CDC is not telling the truth. Her agency's own data does not begin to back the figures in her tweet. Yes. I guess what she lies because she's on the right side. You know, she's trying to do the right thing. Maybe she doesn't always succeed, but you know, you can't blame someone, particularly a woman, for screwing up royally when her heart is in the right place. I mean, it's feelings that count ultimately. And Rachel Walensky has the right kind of feelings. Not the bad kind of feelings, the kind that revolve around, say, empirical evidence or cost-benefit analysis. Those are bad feelings, and we should do everything we can to not have those feelings. In fact, to just eliminate the ground, as it were, from which these feelings rise. I want to talk now about people. I want to talk about triggering, but let's go to the chat. More than 900 people are eaten by crocs in Australia each year, says Texas Feral Hog. What's this? A new commentator whose name I can't really figure out here says, I feel I have seen you somewhere on YouTube. It's possible. I was on Luke Ford's show for a while, and I had a channel. I had a podcast, which was put up on YouTube previously. But he says, stopped reading Denninger years ago. Is he still a dogmatic deflationist? I couldn't say. Metal Mike says, blood clots and heart attacks post-vax are a good thing. It just means the vaccine is working. Birkin Sultanov says, Anglo countries seem to be hardest hit by feminism. Yes, we'll be getting to that very soon. True Greenbeard says, I don't understand why it would only affect younger people. Seems that it must affect us all, and just the younger group is noticed. Well, I can't tell you the reason for that, but the evidence is there. The evidence is there in the numbers. Australia has a low vaccine uptake, thus this fear-mongering had to bring forth another biological Fukushima, says Dan. FBI most wanted Assata Shakur, a BLM icon, is still living in Cuba, says Birkin Sultanov. Of course, this woman, recently profiled by Adam Curtis in his latest documentary series, the mother of Tupac Shakur. Star Rover says Bill Ayers was involved in bombing the U.S. Capitol building in 1971, causing $300,000 in damage. Didn't spend a day in jail, instead became a college professor and Obama's ghostwriter. But you see, the Weather Underground, they were no. As the Symbionese Liberation Army, they've been rehabilitated yet. Kontiki Roulette says, live somewhere with no cell phone signal will protect you from the screaming harridans. Okay, I am going to talk about being triggered to death. And as I mentioned, I don't know how long I can keep up doing what I'm doing on Twitter and on YouTube, because the Canadian government has passed one piece of legislation and has announced another one to combat hate speech. This is from Joan Bryden of the Canadian Press. The Liberal government waited until the House of Commons was about to adjourn for 3 months to introduce a bill aimed at protecting Canadians from online hate speech. Once again, we see all Canadians can expect from the Trudeau Liberals are photo ops and announcements. The Liberal government is only interested in political posturing ahead of the next election, not rooting out hate speech. Oh, I see. So the Conservative Party Justice Critic is all about rooting out hate speech. And guess who gets to define what hate speech is? Bill C-36 would die on the order paper should an election be called. And there are many people who think that Trudeau is going to call an election for two reasons. One, that support for the Conservative Party it hasn't exactly collapsed, but it is cratered, and, well, the Green Party has cratered. This new bill would amend the Canadian Human Rights Act to reinstate an amended version of a controversial section that was repealed in 2013 amid widespread criticism that it violated freedom of speech rights. The bill would define hatred to mean the emotion that involves detestation or vilification that is stronger than dislike or disdain, and it would specify that a statement would not be considered hate speech solely because it discredits, humiliates, or offends. Well, there's a difficulty with that because the Supreme Court of Canada ruled some decades ago that truth is not a defense to an accusation of hate speech. The Justice Minister Lametti said that hate and vilification are realities for Indigenous people, Asian, Jewish, and Black Canadians, alphabet people, and people with disabilities. Yes, everyone except white people, particularly white males. Conservatives condemn all hate speech and speech that incites violence. Yeah, okay. Again, define hate speech for me. Well, they're not going to do it. They're not going to do that for an obvious reason, because it's impossible to pin down what hate speech means. Jody Wilson-Raybould has been triggered. She is the former Justice Minister and Attorney General of Canada, and she is what is called Native Indian royalty. Her father was Bill Wilson, First Nations hereditary chief, who famously, well, he let everyone know just how much he hated white people, despite the fact that he married one. And Jody Wilson-Raybould, of course, well, did the same thing. But she was tossed out of the Liberal cabinet, then the caucus, and then wasn't allowed to run as a Liberal in the last election. She ran as an independent. She won, but she's pretty much disappeared from everyone's radar screen since then. And the Liberals feel that they're going to retake her Vancouver seat. And a Liberal MP had some fun with her, which led to a groveling apology. This is from CTV News, Rachel Aiello, Crown Indigenous Relations Minister. Yeah, Crown Indigenous Relations Minister. Because, we have all these First Nations who are self-governing, except they don't generate, except for a handful of exceptions, they don't generate their own money. They're welfare cases. They do not exercise sovereignty. You cannot exercise sovereignty when you must beg the federal government for money. In the absence of that money, your reserves would no longer exist. But Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett has admitted to and apologized for sending independent MP and former Liberal Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould a text message that Raybould called racist and misogynist. Oh dear. Is it possible for women to be misogynist? Is that possible? Or perhaps we're supposed to believe that Carolyn Bennett has internalized a male way of thinking. So Carolyn Bennett sent a tweet in which she suggested that Jody Wilson-Raybould didn't want an election because she might lose her pension. Yeah, that's all it said. Text message. It said pension. The comment seemed to suggest that Wilson-Raybould calling for Trudeau to stop jockeying for an election was prompted by her own desire to maintain her MP pension, and not because the nation continues to grieve the growing number of unmarked graves being discovered at former residential school sites. Oh, we can't have elections in Canada now because of all this grieving, all this trauma over something that happened 100 years ago. MPs qualify for pensions after holding office for 6 years, a milestone Bennett has already achieved, having first been elected in 1997. Here's how Jody Wilson-Raybould responded. Racist and misogynist text from Carolyn Bennett reflects notion that Indigenous people are lazy and only want money, shows disregard, disdain, and disrespect for Indigenous peoples as in our history, conveys a strong Indigenous woman is a bad Indigenous woman. In other words, I'm just a widow girl. Also, Indigenous. You are not allowed to mock me, to make a little partisan jibe, because that is both racist and misogynist. Any strong woman would not burst into tears or fly into a rage at a little pinprick of mockery from a political rival. But in my country, Native Indians have become sacred monsters. They may not be gainsaid ever for any reason because, I don't know, it's like another genocide or something like that. Women in politics, a good idea? I don't think so. There's this woman who writes for the National Post called Sabrina Maddow, who I believe is some sort of culture critic, some sort of Gossip Girls type. And she has a column. Jody Wilson-Raybould slapdown shows Trudeau liberals nothing but a mean girls clique. In typical Trudeau liberal fashion, Carolyn Bennett knows all the right, politically correct, culturally sensitive things to say, then proceeds to act in direct opposition to them. Lest anyone think Canada is run by a progressive political party and not a contemptuous clique straight out of the movie Mean Girls, Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett felt it prudent to issue a reminder in the form of a bullying, callous text message to independent MP and former Liberal Cabinet Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould. The catalyst for such behavior? Wilson-Raybould expressed understandable horror at the discovery of 751 unmarked graves near a former residential school in Saskatchewan. Yeah. Yes, a bunch of graves weren't kept up. People who died, 100 years ago. And one can see how, well, Jody Wilson-Raybould wouldn't be able to think about anything else. But so here we have a woman who has a column in the National Post, and apparently she's still in high school, at least in her mind. She's still in high school. But speaking about white fragility, this is from popbuzz.com. A story called TikTok's crying trend is getting backlash for being potentially harmful to Black people. The way white women weaponize their tears is the scariest, most dangerous thing ever. A new TikTok trend that involves white women fake crying is receiving backlash. The trend, which is thought to have started in June, that would be this month, involves the participant fake crying to camera before the sound says turn it off, and the person then suddenly stops crying and flashes a chilling smile. This is a story by Jasmine Durib. Although the trend, which is sometimes called the Turn It Off Challenge or the Turn It Off Acting Challenge, started out innocently to show off the user's acting skills, it has triggered the painful discussion of how white women have a history of weaponizing their tears, which has ultimately caused harm to Black people. This might be an example of white women, making fun of themselves. Oh no, wait, this gets better. For example, the story of Emmett Till. No, Emmett Till. A bunch of white women having fun on TikTok by fake crying. Yeah, it all leads back to Emmett Till, because of course it does. Yes, and there's an actual person called Farida said the way white women weaponize their tears is the scariest, most dangerous thing ever. I don't think a lot of white women understand that a lot of Black people are scared, are most scared of them than anyone else. Yes, it is Black women who are scared of white women and not the other way around. Okay. And in more triggering news, Brandeis, which used to be a serious university, I think. This is a story from the New York Post. The rule at this ultra-woke college is don't say rule of thumb. Students and faculty at Brandeis are being urged to stop using certain words. A compendium of potentially oppressive language posted on the school's website by its Prevention, Advocacy, and Resource Center also lists loads of examples of gender-exclusive, ableist, and culturally appropriate terminology that can get in the way of meaningful dialogue. And it's called the Oppressive Language List. Picnic. Can't use picnic because it's associated with lynchings. Yes, of course it is. Of course it is. A suggested alternative is outdoor eating. Rule of thumb can be replaced with general rule because the former allegedly comes from an old British law allowing men to beat their wives with sticks no wider than their thumb. And when it comes to trigger warning, probably use content note instead because the word trigger has connections to guns for many people. That's why the name was chosen. We can give the same heads up using language less connected to violence. One can laugh at all this, snicker, and say it's not significant. It is significant. It's highly significant because we are told we are being put on notice at all times that everything we say or do is harmful or potentially harmful. Oh, you know that thing that you were saying or that thing that you did? It's harmful now. It's racist, it's misogynist, it's emblematic of white supremacy, and you must stop doing it. Now, of course, if a line were drawn under this at any point, okay, these are the rules. If we memorize them and act on them, we'll be safe. But the rules are constantly changing. And the whole point of this is to keep white people in a state of panic and anxiety. But speaking of triggered people, this is from Victoria Friedman at Breitbart. Meghan Mertz and her husband, Prince Harry, allegedly rejected the title Earl of Dumbarton for their son Archie because it contained the word dumb, sources speaking to a major British newspaper have claimed. Before his marriage to the former TV actress, Harry's grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, bestowed on the prince a dukedom, making him the Duke of Sussex, as well as the two subsidiary titles of Earl of Dumbarton and Baron Kilkeel, each title reflecting three historic realms that made up the UK, Scotland, England, and Ireland, respectively. Archie has a right to his father's, Prince Harry's, subsidiary titles, meaning he could have been styled as Lord Archie, Earl of Dumbarton. However, multiple sources speaking to the Telegraph claimed that the title was rejected because it contained the word dumb. This story could be completely made up. It could come out of Buckingham Palace in an attempt to fight back against Harry and Meghan. But it, as Richard Ingrams liked to say, has the ring of truth. Because let's look at their children, or their alleged children, or putative children. The first one was called Archie. Now, that's not a name. Archibald is a name. It's not a name associated with the British royal family, but never mind that. Archie is a diminutive or a nickname. Proper people do not give their children nicknames. You give your child a name, and then you abbreviate it, or people who are friendly, close to family members, whatever, can use it. Yes. They named the second one Lilibet. But we're going to call this child Lily. Then why not call the child Lily full stop? Lily's pretty name, nothing ridiculous about it. That is to say that I think that the Sussexes are so dim-witted and seemingly so ignorant of English usage that they would object to the title of Earl of Dumbarton because it has the word dumb in it. And yeah, well, you reap what you sow, as they say. Guitarist quits Mumford & Sons to speak freely on politics. This is from Associated Press. Winston Marshall, a founding member of the folk rock group Mumford & Sons, announced Thursday he is leaving the band so that he can speak freely about political issues. Marshall took a break from the band in March after sparking a social media storm by tweeting admiration for Unmasked, a book by right-wing writer-activist Andy No that attacked far-left militant groups collectively known as Antifa. Marshall was accused online of endorsing the far right, but said Thursday that nothing could be further from the truth. I condemn unequivocally all political extremism, be it of the right or left. So according to this story, Earlier this year, Marshall co-founded Hong Kong Link Up, a charity that works to integrate Hong Kongers settling in Britain because of increasing political repression in the semi-autonomous Chinese city-state. Oh, so Mumford & Sons is pissing off China now, or communist China. Yes, he has to play the game. Oh, I'm not right-wing because that would be evil. I just, criticize excess. I'm strictly in the middle. Apparently, he says that he was told that he could remain in the band, but that he decided to leave, and I think we can figure out why, because there was a caveat with this offer, namely that if you're going to be with the band, you are not allowed to say anything about politics anymore. Finally, on the subject of triggering, there's a story by Neem Mulvey in Unheard called How to Say Fiction. A romance author, Elin Hildebrand, was hauled over the coals for including an Anne Frank joke in her recently published novel Golden Girl. A teenage girl compares her bedroom for the summer, located in an attic, to the exile of hiding and exclusion Anne Frank and her family had to endure during the Second World War. Now, humor operates in lots of ways. I can't believe I'm writing this, but here we are. One of which is through something called hyperbole, from the Greek, meaning get a grip. This joke is funny because of the contrast between this teenage girl's minor inconvenience and the horrors suffered by Anne Frank and her family. There's also a kind of meta-funniness going on too, I think. The joke seems to invoke the way we cope with the unthinkable horror of the Holocaust by making silly jokes about addicts and Anne Frank. The word we in that sentence is problematic, probably because I'm not Jewish, but well, I think that Anne Frank's work belongs to the world. And for the sin of that thought, I shall begin preparing my own hideaway. I wonder if a way to deal with the endless contretemps around problematic language in literature at the moment is to offer the reader two versions of the work they wish to read. The first is the draft produced by the writer with nothing on her mind but the business of getting a good story onto the page. The second is the version put through the filter of sensitivity readers who will remove anything that could possibly be interpreted by any group as a slight. That way, I think everyone wins. Those who believe literature should deal with how people really are, problematic, offensive, foul-mouthed, can read about that and revel in their damnation, and those who think that literature should show us the higher ideals through characters who never make dodgy jokes can have their safe, clean fun too, although we can never be too sure of this safety, since according to Publishers Weekly, this book had been vetted by sensitivity readers, and still the joke made it through. You see what I was saying just a minute ago? That, oh, yeah, I understand the kind of jokes that I can make and then the kind of jokes that I can't make. And, oh, this joke, the joke is on the privileged white kid, okay? It's not a joke at the expense of Anne Frank or Jewish people, but I suppose it's a question of lèse-majesté. Anyway, I'm going to tell a joke now, which perhaps I will be forbidden to tell in the near future. It involves a woman, an actress called Pia Zadora. I don't know whether you've ever heard of this woman, but she married a very rich Israeli man called Meshulam Riklis, who decided that he was going to make Pia Zadora a star. And he spent a lot of money doing this, and it didn't really work. That Pia Zadora became a joke figure, but she starred in a movie based on a James Cain novel called A Butterfly, and it had, aside from her, it had Stacy Keach, Lois Nettleton, James Franciscus, Edward Albert, Orson Welles, But she won the Razzie for Worst Actress. But here's the joke. Pia Zadora is starring in a stage production of The Diary of Anne Frank. And at the point in the story when the SS show up at the house, the audience as one shouts out, "She's in the attic! She's in the attic!" Anyway, there's my soon-to-be forbidden joke, if it has not been forbidden already. I'm going to get to Ugetsu in just a minute. There's some things I have to open here. And yeah, let's look at the chat. Okay, Texas Feral Hog said, I forgot about the porn movies. KMG was first seen in one of Luke's movies. No, I've never been in a movie of any kind. Okay, so some people like my Piazzadora joke. Let's see. Archie Windsor Markle Mertz, Earl of Dudley. It has a ring to it, says Anne Run. Kontiki Roulette says, after there was an earthquake in Dudley, they say that it cost £5 million worth of improvements. Oh, people are talking about Sheffield. Okay. Sheffield is in Pittsburgh. England needs a damn king, says Caligula 138. Well, I suppose it will have one soon enough, although Queen Elizabeth, she seems to, I'm reminded of a David Mamet joke in which Gene Hackman says, nobody lives forever. And his wife, the actress, says Sinatra gave it a shot. And Queen Elizabeth seems to be giving it a shot. Baron of Sussex, says Chogokin 666. How about Baron of Norfolk? White people don't seem all that panicked anymore. Most of us are wide awake, says True Greenberg. Yeah, I'm not so sure about that. I mean, perhaps people you know. But again, when I go out on the street and I see people wearing masks, half of them or more wearing masks, I think, no, they don't seem very red-pilled to me. Ogan's Iron says, KMG, strong women, according to women's themselves, are the ones not scared of wallowing in self-pity in public. Yes, let me tell you about my feelings. Let me tell you about my mental health issues. So you're demonstrating your strength by talking about a condition which is in some way crippling. Do you sense the paradox there? Being recognizable for appearing on Luke Ford is like being known for having your photo at the post office. Well, I never said that I was, recognizable. I just said some fellow said that he had recognized me on YouTube, and, I was on a different YouTube channel for, I don't know how long it was, a year and a half or whatever. Dan says, sounds more like Jody Wilson-Raybould was projecting. Mike says, by the way, you have no idea just how woke Doug Ford's government is. I have little idea. I've been following his education minister. Again, from Metal Mike, hate speech is any political opinion right of Aaron O'Toole. Of course, Aaron O'Toole has stuck up for Canada Day, and given today's shocking revelation that apparently there are graves in Saskatchewan without any markers, I don't know, speaking up for Canada Day, perhaps that's going to finish him off. True Greenbird says, the Apostle Paul wrote, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, and persecutions, and difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Okay, Theater Thursday. I'm talking about a movie called Ugetsu. That's typically how it's known in the United States. In other places, in Britain, it's known as Ugetsu Monogatari. And it came out in 1953. And it is directed by Kenji Mizoguchi. And he lived from 1898 to 1956. And some of the films that he is, this is the film that he is most admired for. Some of his other films include The Story of the Last Chrysanthemums, The Life of Oharu, Sancho the Bailiff, and The Crucified Lovers. I've been reading about him and his films, and I see that he's been compared to Akira Kurosawa in that his films seem to have been more appreciated by Western audiences than by Japanese audiences. In fact, Kurosawa, throughout his career, was condemned by Japanese critics as not being really Japanese. I suppose perhaps because of his tremendous Western influences, such as, to name two, Shakespeare and Dostoevsky. In fact, Kurosawa so despaired at his critical reputation in Japan that he once attempted a suicide. But this film, Ugetsu, does not seem to me similar to, say, many of Kurosawa's films, in that it seems to be very intensely Japanese in ways that I find difficult to understand. I mean, I'm going to be quite honest about this. I've seen a great number of Japanese films, including most of those Japanese films which are considered to be classic ones, and the Japanese are a people that I find difficult to understand. And one reason why I find them difficult to understand is because of the relationship between reality and fantasy, or perhaps the relationship between the corporeal world and the ghost world, if you will. And this is the ghost world is heavily represented in Ugetsu, which is a film based on a book which came out in 1776, again called Ugetsu. And it's a collection of tales, actually. And the film Ugetsu is based on two of these tales. The movie can be seen as a very strong anti-war film. And an anti-war film, most anti-war films deal with the suffering of soldiers. Ugetsu deals with the suffering of civilians, particularly the suffering of women. Now, the film, it shows a Japan which, well, it appears to have been, blighted by war, specifically the Civil War of the 16th century. But of course, we hear of war profiteers, and our main character, Genjuro, is a farmer, but he is also a potter, and he is very good at what he does. And his village is in the midst of, well, there are opposing armies on both sides, and armies need supplies. Now, of course, in the worst of war, they simply steal what they want. They steal goods, they steal equipment, they steal food, they steal men, they steal women. But in the lead up to the actual fighting, much money can be made selling things to armies. So Genjuro has a wife called Miyagi, and has a young son called Genichi. And we see from the beginning, we see that he is a ambitious man, Genjuro. He is not satisfied with his status in the world, and he sees the war, as the upcoming war, as an opportunity to increase his status and to increase the amount of money that he has, and to buy his wife, whom he loves, a beautiful kimono, which she has never had before. Also in this village is a man called Toby, who he seems to be something of a simpleton and half demented. Now, he has a wife, Ohama. I should say that both of these wives are intensely devoted to their husbands, but these devotions are largely ignored by their husbands for reasons of greed or for a lust for glory. Because Toby is determined to become a samurai. He's determined to become a great warrior, but of course, One needs money to become a samurai. One needs armor. One needs a uniform. One needs enough money for a spear and a sword. And these things do not come cheap. They are not laid on as in a modern army. And he is always looking to run away to one of these armies where he, for some reason, he believes he's going to be allowed to become a samurai. Eventually, he does, and he has a surprising success at this. So there's an initial sale of goods by Genjuro, and he makes a lot of money, more money than he's ever seen in his life. And he buys all manner of things, clothing and food and drink. But he is looking rather, as in a gangster film, for one last big score. And his wife pleads with him not to do this because it is too dangerous, that they have enough money to live on for quite some time. And she has him and their son, and that is enough for her. Well, it's not enough for Genjuro. And so he there is a frantic pot making. Got to keep the kiln fired up. And they're forced to flee their village because the army comes in, and they hide in the mountains. And Tobi runs away. He's going to be a samurai. His wife cannot stop him. And Genjuro decides that he is going to sneak back into his village, which he does. And to his horror, the kiln fire has gone out. But then, to his delight, the pots are finished. So all the pots are removed, and they are wrapped. And so the plan is that they are going to take them to a different village to sell, only not go by land, to go over a lake. And there is a exceedingly beautiful scene, which is shot in a studio, of a mist-strewn lake, which is it really does invoke ghosts, and it is the spookiest scene on a lake that I have seen since the famous one in Murnau's Silence. I can't say whether the scene in Ugesu was influenced by that. So they see another boat while they're on the lake, and there's a gravely wounded man who tells them that he has been attacked by pirates, and that everyone on this lake has to fear pirates. And he urges them to turn back. Well, Genjuro is not going to turn back. However, he is going to deposit his wife and child on the shore of the lake because they are, surplus baggage. I suppose there's an attempt to shield them, but it's a cruel thing to do. And you see the pain on his wife's face because she wonders whether she will ever see her husband again, and whether their son will ever see their father again. Well, it doesn't end all of that well for the women. Rachara is she's abandoned, and as I mentioned before, that soldiers in the height of battle will steal everything. And Miyagi is gang raped by a bunch of soldiers who contemptuously throw some coins next to her weeping body. This is on the floor of a shrine, no less. And let's see, Genjuro's wife, she is forced to flee again with enough food, enough rice for perhaps a few days for her and for her son. And Miyagi is attacked by soldiers, and that's the last that we see of the wife and the son. We have very strange fate in store for both Genjuro and for Toby. That Genjuro in the market is having a great success selling his goods. And then, as if in an apparition, we see a very strange woman dressed in the height of no fashion, with the appropriate makeup, with an elderly retainer. And they are enchanted by his goods, and they buy a whole bunch of them, and he is instructed to deliver them to the castle. And he's quite frightened by this, because the woman, I posted a picture, a screen cap, which you can find on my Twitter account. She does look like an apparition. So he follows the old lady to the castle, and he is bewitched by the young woman, the great lady, who, in a strange turn of events, says that he is the love of her life, and that he must love her beyond all else, and that he must devote the rest of his life to serving only her and her every need. And it's implied rather cleverly, this movie's not particularly graphic, that there is a strong sexual connection between Genjuro and the apparition. Of course, he has a wife and child, which he seems to have forgotten, or perhaps that it has been taken from his mind by Lady Wakasa, who is the ghost woman. Now, Toby, who continues to act, like as a buffoon, he has an extraordinary stroke of luck, no pun intended, where he happens upon the scene where the great general who has been defeated demands that one of his soldiers behead him, to indicate his shame, and which is done. And Toby steals the head and delivers it to the victorious general, who says, "You can have whatever you like." And he says, "I demand a horse and vassals." So he has a fine spectacle of a man, finally. And we see him on his way. He stops by a village and passes a brothel. He is in a hurry, but his vassals, they want women, and they want rest. And so, being the gracious samurai that he is, he decides that he's going to stay the night and let the soldiers have their fun, where he discovers to his horror that his wife has become a prostitute. And she is understandably furious with him and tries to strangle him. He is aghast at what has happened, and he pledges that he will restore her honor. Genjuro, on the way back to buy precious things, the most beautiful kimonos for his new wife, his second wife, runs into a priest who tells him that he has the aura of death about him, that he intuits that Genjuro is engaged in an activity which is forbidden, that he has entered into the spirit world, and that if he does not remove himself from the spirit world, he will himself die and be punished for his transgression. And so Sanskrit characters, a kind of, how would you say, exorcism is written on his chest and his back. He returns to the castle, where immediately Lady Wakasa and the elderly retainer, they realize what's up. And so we have nothing less than a battle for his soul. And Genjuro manages to escape, where he is set upon by soldiers who accuse him of stealing a valuable sword. And he tells them the story about, how he was brought to the castle, and they think that he's a madman because what castle are you talking about? Because there is no castle, because everything was destroyed, because the Wakasa family was on the losing side of the Civil War. I mean, one of the themes that runs very strongly through Ugetsu is that, in a way, there are no victors in a civil war, because both sides are devastated, and the damage that is done will take years or perhaps decades to heal. So both the men find their way home. I won't spoil the ending for you, except to say that it is enormously moving. I suppose you could say, ars longa vita brevis, that life is short, but art is long, which is true of this movie. And it's true of how this situation resolves itself. And again, I wrestle with this conundrum: to what extent do the Japanese believe that the spirit realm is real, that the spirit realm, how would you say, interacts with the corporeal realm? Mizoguchi famously left his cinematographer to do all the shots. But of course, Mizoguchi had some very strong ideas about how shots should be made, how they should be set up. And the photography and the use of camera in this film, as well as the lighting, is really extraordinary. I could point out that this movie obviously cost a lot of money. When you look at the number of extras in it, it seems to be, fiercely real at the same time that it is just hovering on the edge of, escaping reality. The music used in the film is traditional or medieval Japanese music, for the most part, which greatly enhances the mise-en-scène. Now, looking at different versions of this film, it's a familiar story that most Japanese films, they were not, even the classics, were not really preserved very well, and for the longest time were available in really crummy DVD transfers. Then, I think in 2012, Masters of Cinema, which you've heard me rave about before, brought out a dual format edition in the DVD and a Blu-ray, which was a significant upgrade. A significant upgrade over everything that we had seen before. But then in 2015, led by Martin Scorsese and others, there was a complete remastering and restoration of Ugetsu, which was released by Criterion, both in the United States and in the United Kingdom. And it is an absolute revelation. It looks so much better than the Masters of Cinema version for a film that was made so long ago, 1953, and as I say, was treated so badly in terms of initial preservation. There are very few weaknesses. I didn't see any scratches. Often you have this trouble with flickering or faintness of image. There is some of that in the Criterion version of it, but very little indeed. There is nothing in the Criterion presentation of this film which would put people off from watching it. Quite the opposite. And again, I'm struck by the power that black and white has as opposed to a color. Because, in a black and white film, one really needs to work harder in order to make the images beautiful. This movie, Ugetsu, had a tremendous effect on me as a visual experience and as an emotional experience. And I recommend it most highly. Let's look at the chat. My favorite samurai movie is Memoirs of a Geisha, says Texas Feral Hog. Careful using death aura. Many non-fatal illnesses also present this. Please keep in mind before you start telling people that they are about to die. Okay. Caligula 138 says, my favorite samurai film is probably Sword of Doom. Of course, there's many, samurai films, and many of them are, rah-rah kind of heroic films. But this is Ugetsu is very much a contemplative film about samurais and the military life. Also bothered and bewildered, said Anne Run. Okay. I find the Japanese a great and high culture in so many aspects, says Chogokin 666. Caligula says, have you seen the French movie noir Le Samurai by Jean-Pierre Melville? Yes, I have. I have talked about my great admiration for Melville on many occasions, specifically two of his films. Of course, you know that the saying, the quotation at the beginning of Le Samurai is completely made up. Melville loved to do that sort of thing. Okay, that is the show for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. I will be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. And tomorrow is the book club. And what I'm going to be talking about on the book club is a memoir, military memoir, of the Second World War. An unusual man who had an unusual military career, Peter Kemp, and it's called No Colors or Crest. If you like the show or any part of it, I would appreciate it if you click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not done so already. If you would like to support this live stream with a donation, which would be very gratefully treated at this time because of my current, situation. My PayPal account is attached to Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. Once again, Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. If you are in Canada, donations can be made directly via Interac at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I leave you with this: in these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.